When rendering for print or web, resolution is one of the main concerns. You're usually going to want a high resolution for print, somewhere in the range of 2,000 to 3,000 pixels. Be very careful though. It's easy to create an image that's higher resolution than the printer can actually make use of. So if you render a resolution that's too high, all you're doing is wasting resources. The best thing to do is talk to your printer and establish ahead of time what pixel resolution you need for a specific printer type, because different printers often use different image pixel resolutions. Lower resolution is usually appropriate for web because it makes for smaller file sizes which download much faster. File types that are typical for print or web would be a PNG file, which is a highly compressed but visually lossless, high-quality image that can be used for web pages. And because it's visually lossless, it maintains the image quality even though it is a compressed file and is good for that type of use. JPEG is often required by clients and is used widely on the internet because it's a highly compressed file and can have a very small file size. However, it's not a visually lossless image, and the higher levels of compression will start to degrade the quality of the image and can even get to a point where the image is unusable. So this is a good file type for web delivery, but I don't know if I would necessarily use it for high-resolution printing. The file type that's often used in the print industry is the TIFF file. This file type has several options, and when saving out of 3ds Max, can either be compressed or uncompressed, and the file can have specific printer resolution assigned within the file itself. Like PNG files, like the PNG file, the compression on a TIFF file is also a lossless type of compression. There are many other file types that you can render out of 3ds Max. These are just a few examples. The main point is that you need to determine the image type you will need to deliver prior to any production work, especially before you get to the rendering stage. Let's go into 3ds Max and see how we set the output for still images. There are a few steps involved: the resolution of the image, setting the file type, and then making some adjustments in the file type setup. We don't need to have anything in our scene because we're not actually going to render anything. We want to go to the main toolbar and click on the Render Setup icon. This opens the Render Setup dialog. In the time output area, we want to use a single image that will render just one frame for print or web. And in the output size area, we need to determine the width and height pixel resolution. As you can see, we currently have a custom resolution. If you click the drop-down arrow in the output size options drop-down list, you can see additional options that are available. Many of these options deal with video or animation resolution and not necessarily print or web. So in this case, we would use the type in. Currently, the 640 pixels width by 480 pixels height may be good for an image that would be posted to a website. But for print, we may need to type in a value of, say, 3,000 horizontal pixels and 2,400 vertical. This sets the resolution that we've predetermined with our client. Then scroll down in the Common tab of the Render Settings dialog to the Render Output area. On the right-hand side, click the Files option. This opens the Render Output File dialog. When we click on the Save as Type drop-down list, we're presented with a number of options. In this case, we're going to select the PNG file format. This is a good file format for outputting to the web. Since we're not rendering anything, it really doesn't matter what the file name is, so I'm going to type in testrender.png, and I'm going to hit the Tab key. Once I hit the Tab key, I can then click on the Setup button, That opens the PNG configuration dialog. And for standard web output, I might click and select 24-bit RGB. And if I'm going to use transparency, I can check the alpha channel. For each file type, there are different options in their setup. So we'll go ahead and click OK. Since we're not going to be rendering this image, go ahead and click Cancel to close this dialog. And go ahead and close the render dialog. Again, it's very important to know what type of file you will be rendering ahead of time in order to avoid any unnecessary work or the possibility of needing to re-render your entire scene. If you plan on delivering animation files to your client, it is much more important that you pre-plan your output with your client before you begin rendering your animations. This ensures that everyone understands what format will be output for delivery of the final video file. The resolution is important, of course. If you are rendering high resolution, say for 1280 by 720 or above, you may have problems playing those back reliably on some standard computers. The HDTV format is not necessarily the resolution. There are several HDTV resolutions available, going from the large format 1920 by 1080 down to 1280 by 720. And this format is becoming increasingly popular as HDTV moves into people's homes and into businesses. Another possibility would be that you would render a low-resolution animation that's going to be put up on a website so that anyone can play it back. Or you may be going to a service like YouTube with a resolution, say, of 320 by 240 or 640 by 480. Again, because of the range of possibilities, it's important to make that determination early on in the project. In general, the file types you'll be using are going to be AVI or QuickTime formats. Again, determining upfront what your needs are will determine whether or not you deliver in one of these formats. There are several other formats available for video delivery that we have not discussed here, including MP4 and MPEG. You might think, it's easy, I'm just going to render an AVI file. However, it needs much more planning than that. You need to know which codec you'll be using to deliver the animation. An AVI file can use a number of available codecs for compression. QuickTime files also have a variety of codecs that you can choose from. The codec is the method that is used for compressing and playing back the video file on a computer. So it's critical that you choose one that your client can play back, because you can send them a file that looks fantastic on your computer, but if your client has an older computer system, it may not play back smoothly or at all on their computer system. One popular codec is H.264. The problem you'll run into is that not all computers can play this codec back, which means the playback computer must be able to play the same codec back as the recording computer is using. Another codec that's available and widely popular is DivX. This codec can deliver high-quality video files that are relatively small in size. Again, determining all this in the beginning, in the pre-planning stage, will save both time and money, not to mention the headache you'll get from delivering an animation file to a client that client can't view.
Rendering animations in 3ds Max is done very similarly to still image output, so let's take a look. Click on Render Setup in the main toolbar. In the Render Setup dialog, Common tab, Time Output group, we want to choose the active time segment. This is so that we will be rendering a series of images instead of just one still. You can also set a range of frames if you don't want to render all the frames that are in the active time segment. Then, we set our output size resolution by clicking the drop-down list. This is when we may decide to use the HDTV resolution, for example. We'll choose HDTV, and in this case, 1280 by 720 to render a 720p video format. Scroll down to Render Output and click the Files button. This brings us to the Render Output File dialog. Let's first type in a name. Let's type in testvideo.avi. And we'll select from the Save As file types the AVI format. Now, the AVI format is a great format for playing back. However, when you're rendering straight to an AVI format, if your computer crashes halfway through, or your computer shuts off halfway through rendering, when you restart 3ds Max, you have to start rendering from the very first frame of your animation. Rendering to a sequence of images can avoid this problem. But for this demonstration, we'll choose the AVI format. Now, when you click the Setup button, you can choose the codec that you would like to use from the compressor dropdown. Your list may vary from mine depending on what codecs you have installed on your computer and what version of Windows you're running. You can always add a new codec to your computer. Most of them offer a very simple installation process. These are just the ones that 3ds Max can see on my computer. Click Cancel, that will close the setup dialog, and we'll click Cancel to close the Render Output File dialog. And since we're not going to be saving anything, we can close the Render dialog as well.
Another aspect of pre-planning your production deals with scene organization. One aspect of scene organization that we'll talk about now is working with layers. If you're familiar with a CAD program like AutoCAD, then you're probably familiar with the idea of using layers to organize your scene. If you are new to the idea of layers, they allow you to separate elements in your scene by assigning each object to a particular layer. So for instance, we're rendering an animation of a very complex building that consists of several floors with lights on each floor, furniture for each floor, and geometry that makes up each floor of the building itself. Using layers, we can separate objects by floor, and if we break it down even further, we can assign the lights on a particular floor, the furniture on a particular floor, and the geometry associated with that floor to its own layer. Another reason to use layers is that you can access the properties for each layer. For instance, if I want to hide geometry that I don't want to render, I can set the layer for the geometry to be hidden. For example, in our building, if we're rendering a walkthrough of the second floor, and this was a 4-floor building, we would want to hide the layers for all the floors except the second floor. This would make our render time much faster and make working with the geometry much more efficient. We also have access to each layer's render options, which allows us to specify how a particular layer can be rendered in the scene. This can be useful when you are rendering a scene for compositing, to be able to specify which objects render and how they render. While layers are not the only means of organizing your 3ds Max scene, understanding how layers work can certainly make working with 3ds Max more efficient.